very active in the chat, Debbie. So you can expect that.
Nick did not.
Typing away. I'm still having this debate with my teens. They claim it's faster to text than it is to type in a computer. I'm like, it just can't be right. But
No.
It's certainly not the
It's
case for
faster
me.
for them to text because it's younger.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well,
the thing I did learn is you can never win an argument with a teenager.
Yeah.
we all have thumbs that were trained on a BlackBerry. So, that's saying something.
So
Which
Brian,
is a keyboard I still miss, by the way.
I do too.
yeah, I miss it. I was so good
The
at that.
tactile feel, that lovely little tactile feel.
So I try and get my teams to talk by Slack because I could do it on the keyboard.
Yeah.
And but they all want to talk by, like, especially on global ones, by WhatsApp. And I'm like, no.
Don't ever say that. Well, I'm glad you're saying it here because I'm sure there's a CIO someplace in your organization that just loves that. Just, that's a glorious one when you have people on WhatsApp doing business communications.
Debbie, is that more WhatsApp? I discovered it seems to be less North America. Like
It's European.
Yeah, European and Asia are big on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah.
US, it's less.
They don't look at Slack. They don't look even at their, like, texting, their SMSs. They are WhatsApp.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm working with, for example, I'm actually doing a pretty cool randomized control trial out in Turkey on some work from home in a big company in there. It's all WhatsApp. So
Yeah.
even though they have a company communication channel and a chat thing, they all use WhatsApp because it's.
So Brian, why do our CIOs hate it? Because it's not.
Company communication sitting inside of other companies' data repositories, just generally not a happy thing when they don't have control over it.
I saw in the chat there was a WhatsApp for the web. I gotta try that.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think there was a big blow up in financial services, if I remember correctly, too, around usage of WhatsApp, which I think is, I think it's explicitly prohibited for a bunch of types of communications in financial services.
Yeah. Yeah, they get a little understandably nervous because they're not supposed to do that, right? All your communication is supposed to be tracked.
Chat, by the way, relates to the topic because aligning on asynchronous communication is actually, or synchronous is technology, important part of getting flexible work.
What is our team's norm around which tools do we use for what purpose, Debbie?
Exactly. So we're on topic. We're not doing our usual migration.
Yeah, exactly.
All roads slowly lead back to remote and distributed work related topics. All right, it is 3 past, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure a few more folks will trickle in. For those that are joining us for the first time for State of Flex, welcome. For those that have joined us before, this is I think it's our 5th edition already of State of Flex, which is pretty cool. It's also the second one that Brian Elliott has joined us for, in addition to Debbie and to Nick. Thank you to the 3 of you again for joining me for this. A couple of housekeeping items to understand about the way that we do this. One, we split the time roughly about half and half. The first 30 minutes or so, we'll do quick presentations. So each of us has put together roughly 4 or 5 slides of things that we think are pretty interesting on different related topics around remote work, flexible work, enjoyment at work, a number of things like that. So we'll go through that in rapid fire succession, kind of one to the next. The second 30 minutes is all Q&A. So a couple of things that you can do housekeeping wise. One, there's a Q&A tab that you should see at the bottom of the Zoom panel. You can put in questions there. You can also thumbs up other people's questions. Please do that if someone writes something that you're interested in, because it helps us figure out what are the ones that we should make sure to answer live, and we'll do our best to do that. The other is this time we enabled chat, which people are already making good usage of. And we did that in order to enable other conversation or topic or discussion to happen in parallel while we're presenting, in case there are topics that we don't get to or questions that people want to discuss in parallel, if you will, while we're going through other topics. And so please feel free to use the chat there. Otherwise, we're recording, and so this will be live and available on our YouTube channel and also on the FlexIndex site afterward, and we will send a link to the materials too, in case people are interested in seeing the slides we put together. Did I miss anything that we normally cover in housekeeping on the front end? Does that sound good?
Yeah.
No? All right, then we will go ahead and get started with some of the presentation materials. All right. So for quick background on me, so I'm Rob Sadow. I'm the CEO and co-founder of FlexIndex. FlexIndex is the largest insight and data platform related to flexible work. We cover more than 12,000 companies now on the platform. Those companies have more than 100,000 offices. They employ more than 120 million people around the world. We've also, over the last several months, built some pretty cool additional pieces of insight and analysis and products to leverage what's on Flex Index. One is FlexGPT, which allows you to query any question you might have around Flex Index and actually pull that insight for you in a chart. So you can check that out for free if you want to and play with it a little bit. And the second is Office Benchmarks, as we start to expand beyond policy data into workplace usage data for companies to be able to compare how they're using workplaces with other companies that have similar policies to theirs. So that's some of the stuff that we do at Flex Index. If you go to the next slide, this week we put out our most recent quarterly report. And one of the topics that we were interested in looking at was the economy is an interesting place right now in the United States. There's a lot of discussion around where are we at in the cycle? Are rates going to start being cut? What's happening with unemployment, which has picked up a little bit over the last few reports. And so we were curious to look and see, is this starting to have any ramification yet in flexible work policy? One of the things that's been a hot topic of discussion over the past years, I would say, is what happens if the economy weakens? Do we start to see more return to office? Will the power dynamic, if you will, change between company and employee in terms of where people work? So this is the most recent data that we have. So you can look at quarter by quarter from when we started tracking Q1 of 2023 up to this quarter, percentage of firms in the US on an industry weighted basis that offer some level of work location flexibility, meaning that they either are hybrid or are fully remote in nature, versus companies that expect full-time in office for corporate employees. As you can see, Q1 23 to Q2 24, we saw a pretty steady march upward from 51% of companies offering work location flex all the way up to 69% of companies offering work location flexibility. This past quarter, we saw a slight pullback. So 69% dropped to 67%, and then percentage of full-time in office came up from 31% to 33%. So we're still at about 2/3 of companies offering flexibility, 1/3 full-time in office. Not too much movement yet, but it's something we're interested to track over the coming quarters and see whether that changes, reverses, especially based on the economy as we get new news in over the coming months. On the next page, one thing we also like to look at is what does that actually translate to, at least from a policy perspective, in terms of how much time is spent in the workplace or is expected to spend in the office on a weekly basis. So we took all of the companies that we have that are US headquartered on Flex Index and looked at what are the percentage of companies that require 0 days in the office, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, all the way up to full-time in office. And we translate it. So some companies have a minimum. If it's a minimum of 3 days, we count it as 3. Some companies have specific day policies like Tuesday and Thursday. If that was the case, we would count it as 2. So it's roughly made equivalent to understand what the expectation is on a weekly basis. The average across the US, across all firms, is 2.63 days per week in office. So think about that as a little bit more than half the time expected to spend in the office, the other half the time given flexibility to work remotely. Interestingly enough, this is up quarter over quarter. So it's 2.63 days now. It was 2.49 a quarter ago. Not too much movement that we've seen over the last 5-6 quarters. It's oscillated roughly in the 2.4 to 2.7 range over that period. One of the things I think is most interesting about the US is how polarized it is, though. So if you look at the percentage that are 0 days or 5 days, 62% of firms are either no required office time or full required office time for corporate employees. Only 21% of them are actually 3 days, 12%, or 2 days. It's pretty uncommon to find 1 day or 4 day a week as a policy. So this is something that we're tracking, and I'll be curious to see if this average ticks upward at all over the coming months relative to what's happening in the economy broadly. On the next page, one of the things we like to look at also is the split by size. And so in this chart, you can see by company size, so from less than 500 employees up to 25,000 plus employees, what are the percentage of firms that have a full-time in office policy versus structured hybrid, meaning there's an expectation on time spent in the office that's dictated by the company or dictated by the department, but it's not full-time, versus fully flexible, meaning employees do not have to have any time in the office by requirement. Less than 500 employees, almost 3/4 of them are what we call fully flexible, meaning either the company has offices, but employees aren't required to go into them, or the company is fully remote entirely. If you look on the other side of the bottom bar at 25,000 plus employee companies, only 13% of them are fully flexible. 62% are structured hybrid, and 25% are full-time in office. So you can see as companies get larger, the desire for more structure and more time in office increases all the way up to, if you look at that bottom bar, 87% of the companies that are 25,000 employees or more have some required office time component to their policy. Interestingly, if you look at the next slide, we look at this also in, or actually go back one for a second. One point I wanted to add on this also before I move on is when we looked at that mix of how policies have evolved quarter over quarter, and we talked about how across the US it went from 31% were full-time in office to 33% full-time in office, we actually find it is disproportionately in those larger firms where that's happened. So a quarter ago, if you were to look at that 25,000 plus employee bar, 18% were full-time in office. This quarter, based on what we're tracking, it's 25%. So that's one of the things we're going to watch pretty closely too over the coming quarters. The last piece then on the next slide I wanted to share is while we do see larger companies expecting more time in office in terms of the percentage of firms that have some required office time and the amount of office time, it's not uniform across the age of firms. And one of our favorite pieces of analysis to do is to look at cohorted by year for companies, and this is for companies with 500 employees or more, what's the percentage that offer work location flexibility based on the year the company was founded? So you can see from pre-1980 to 81 to 90, 91 to 2000, 2001, 2010, 11 to 14, how does that evolve over time? You can see it's pretty flat actually for 2000 and before, right? So 66% offer work location flex to 68 to 70. When you get to the more recent years, it jumps up to 78% for 2001 to 2010, and then 89% for 2011 to 2024. So that's a pretty staggering number that almost 90% of the companies with 500 employees or more that were started roughly in the last 15 years offer work location flexibility. The implication of this, and one of the things we're watching for, is what happens as these firms become a greater and greater share of the large company base over time. Because with each passing year, the percentage of large firms in the workforce that were founded post 2011 will increase just naturally, you know, as older firms die out and more new firms are founded. And so we'll continue to watch that and see if it changes the competitive mix or whether it causes some of the holdout firms that are full-time in office to feel like they have to offer flexibility to compete with some of these upstarts that are offering flexibility at higher levels. All right, and with that, I will pass it over to Nick.
Thanks very much, Rob. Great to be on our quarterly update again. And I'm going to talk about events. Next slide, thanks. So, you know, events are very much the new big thing. I know they're around since pre-pandemic, but they've really taken off. And when I'm talking about events here, I'm really talking about internal company events. So it's when people get together to meet, to spend time face to face. Why is that? Well, the big reason is as we are spending more time not working in the office, there's a feeling that maybe we want some more connectivity, some more time mentoring, some more time in person. And so earlier in the year, we set up a big survey to try and figure out what's going on in event life. What do events look like? And the summary is they tend to be, compared to at least what we thought, short, small, and local. And I should point out that kind of reminded me of my history at school, where we talked about cave life as a short, nasty, and brutish. So event life is thankfully much better than cave life, so not to confuse the two of them. Next slide, thanks. So first thing is events are extremely popular. So we surveyed folks back in Feb 2024. Turns out about 40 or 42% of employees, which is about 60 million people in the US alone, went to one in 2023. Turns out a very similar set of people work in an office. So you should really think of the labor force divided into office workers, which is about 40%, and they tend to be going to an average 2-3 events a year. And non-office workers, think of people in retail, manufacturing, healthcare. These folks typically are not going to events, but for the world of professionals, managers, folks in offices, this has become a very normal activity once or twice a year. So what do these things look like? Next slide, thanks. So first thing, I was kind of surprised they're much smaller than I'd think. So I had in my mind, you know, like Salesforce, I think they've got rid of it. They had that ranch down in Southern California. I kind of thought events were like hundreds of people, and you see these photos meeting up in some big gathering, or, you know, Zapier, Atlassian, you know, GitHub, they have these large kind of well-known national, regional, global gatherings. Turns out they exist. You can see that 3% of folks say the last event they went to had over 500 people, but typically there's actually a lot smaller. So 2/3 of these things have 50 employees or less. So you should think of the classic event is you're getting together with, I don't know, 20, 30 folks from your company. It's an internal only thing. And, it's not some huge cross-country international gathering. Next slide, thanks. Secondly, they tend to be short. So you notice that half of them are less than a full day. So this is something that's maybe a morning plus lunch or lunch plus the afternoon. A full day is the next option. Events, internal company events that are more than a day, actually really rare. So again, I had in mind these, multi-day event things. They do happen, they are there, but actually, there's only, there's kind of 80% or less that are a day. So these are, you can imagine, some PowerPoint events, some meetings, some discussion, training. There's a mix of activities, but they're typically, they don't involve, multiple days. Next slide, thanks. And finally, they're local, although you can see this to some extent is bimodal. So less than, about 60% of them, just under 60% of them are about an hour away. So going through what I've just told you, the most common type of event is you and 30 people, or you and 25 folks from your company organization maybe get together in New York or Atlanta or London. You meet for, the morning and lunch, you travel there, you have a bunch of activities and leave. You noticed here, there's about a quarter that are 5 or more hours. So there is a smaller group of bigger, maybe national, maybe even, for the Americas, for Europe events. So the classic cadence would be something like you're meeting quarterly for a number of companies. It's small local events, but maybe once a year, maybe once every other year, there's a big national or international event and people connect up this way. And it looks like, come back to Rob said, hybrid is very much here to stay. So the typical person is working from home or, cafe or wherever they are 2-3 days a week. That's been very successful. It's stuck. We see in our Sway data, we see in the Castle data, a number of other data sets, this is permanently here. And a thing that's taken off to supplement this, to provide a little bit more in-person time, is events. And as I've shown you, these are mostly actually small local things happening, every 3 months, 25 people in the neighborhood. Okay, I'll stop. Thanks, and move on.
And I think that's my turn. Hi, I'm Brian Elliott. Let's go to the next slide. I decided I needed a graphic that was more obnoxious than Nick's one of people in a cave being brutish. So instead, it's your usual mythology around Gen Z, right? So we've all heard some variant of some of these things. They really don't want to work. And then I've heard both sides of this one. They never want to come into the office. They want to be fully remote, or they always want to come into the office. And it's usually spoken by somebody who's probably about my age, who happens to have kids like I do that are newly in the workforce, that is taking their sample size of 2 and extrapolating it to the entire population. They're not motivated by comp. They're job hoppers. They're more open on mental health issues. They have more issues, period. All of this are things that are being said about these people that turns out aren't really accurate. So let's go to the next page. Number 1, they don't want to work hard. This is a brief history of kids these days. Kids these days just don't want to work hard anymore. The 1894 one that's in there was from, these are all from newspapers and are variations of what we've heard over time. I'm Gen X myself. We were once upon a time called slackers. The millennials also were supposed to be people who didn't want to work very hard. Omar Ramirez is, I think, the person who when I put this one up originally, said something to the effect of, you can track this back to Aristotle, who said, this next generation that's coming up behind us just really doesn't want to work very hard. So that's basic mythology around this one. There are some differences, especially in terms of how they work and how they operate. Let's get into the next page. Gen Z itself is going to be 25% of the workforce next year, 39% by 2030. We now have 4 generations working in the US workforce simultaneously. So that's a big deal in and of itself. Gen Z will also be the first generation in the workforce that is the majority non-white. So greater diversity as well, which is a big deal. Amanda Schneider and I worked on a piece that I'll show you on the next page. Amanda leads Think Lab, and they've done a fair amount of research into Gen Z. There are some real differences, some of which come down to things like being more oriented around purpose. As each generation goes by, they get more purpose oriented, and in their case specifically, more team driven as well. meaning they actually want to do work together in teams. They actually depend on one another. They do face a different world than many of us did coming out of it. The cost of housing in the United States or the UK or most of Western Europe is substantially different as a percentage of their incomes than it was for my generation in particular. They're also facing climate change, so you can understand why they might have some differences. When it comes to hybrid and remote work, however, both of those polls are absolutely false. They're the generation that is least likely to want to be fully remote or fully in the office. It's actually people 50 and older, hi, it's me, that are most likely to want one end or the other of that set of extremes. They want to come together like most of us do for socialization and for mentorship. They are also less likely to ask their manager for help. That one came out of Amanda's work as well. And maybe really importantly, like the millennials before them, they are digital natives. They're very used to building and maintaining relationships online as much as in the workplace. So let's get into some things that we could do to help bridge some of these gaps on the next page. This comes from if you want to read it, there's an MIT Sloan Management Review piece that Amanda and I put out about this specific topic. Number one, from a hybrid perspective, both and really is the way to think about this. Debbie and the team at BCG have done some great work showing that team level agreements not only work for organizations, they actually yield the best results in terms of people's engagement, in terms of their satisfaction, in terms of their compliance, in terms of their productivity, in terms of their energy levels. Getting people to talk about it together makes a big difference. Focusing them on social relationship building, on mentorship ends up being really important. You have to provide them with collaborative spaces as opposed to the stuff we all left in 2019. And increasingly, I'm seeing organizations do one thing, which is they're actually thinking a lot more strongly in the past 2 years about where are we hiring younger employees in particular, meaning we're willing to hire senior engineers on a much more distributed basis, but we're thinking about our younger, newer generation of employees and trying to have them be a little bit more located in a fewer number of hubs so that it is easier to bring them together, for them to come together, and preferably for them to come together with their bosses more often. Connection itself is both and, meaning you've got to flip this on the other side of it and think about how do you use your Gen Z employees and your millennials to teach older leaders like me how to actually correspond, collaborate, build relationships in digital channels as well. You can't just say, I'm the executive, come and find me an email. You've got to get into Teams and Slack and the tools that your teams use on a regular basis. These are also folks where you can ask them for help and for advice. The Gen Z shadow board is a concept that we picked up on in the article, started out by Gucci, who actually used it to figure out what was going wrong with their brand. It helped them understand externally how they should position themselves with this generation. It's also equally applicable in terms of how you think about tapping the expertise and knowledge of a generation within your own workforce and what you could be doing internally. Last and definitely not least, what people are looking for is what they're always looking for. Leadership that gives them clear goals and sets clear expectations of them, but also leadership that's willing to reach out to them, to ask them not only for their opinions, but what do they need to be successful. So I tested all this with my own shadow board. Let's go to the last page. This is a result from one of my 2 sons. I sent him the article. This is his response back that he's become my new shadow board. He also, as you read through the whole thing, you'll realize he's never read the book that I wrote 2 years ago. So nice of the kid to confess that he hasn't read it. And I shall ask the Gen Z Council if they agree with all the points that I just made. My other son simply responded when I asked him and said, I'm too busy working. I don't have time for your stuff. So with that, we'll move on to Debbie.
Great. Well, I'm going to pull us up. Really great stuff, all 3 of you. Hard to go last. But I'm going to pull us up to, the 10,000 or 100,000 feet level, because, there's no one who's more passionate about hybrid work and flexible work and distributed work and investing in making it work to me. But I've come to the realization that it's a symptom of a much, much, much bigger and more important problem, which is what organizations focus on. So if you flip to the next slide, I'll give you some context for this point of view. So I entered the workforce in the late 80s. And when I entered, it was all about shareholder value. Like, that's the only thing you worry about. You take everything from the lens of shareholder value. And then sometime, early 90s, we got into the customer is king and customer value and segment of one and segmentation and deep customer discovery and then technical, functional, and emotional benefits, and Satya Nadella and Amazon made it famous with, Amazon had the empty seat at every meeting table to represent the customer in the room. And Satya tried to, and did, turn around Microsoft with customer obsession, right, as one of the levers. And I believe we are on the verge of what I'm starting to call radical employee centricity. For too long, employees have been treated as a means of production, a means of the end, and so like it's like we're conflicted. We are so sophisticated around the customer, and the employees are treated like a cog or all the same. And and people call things employee journeys, but they're really not. They're just benefits and onboarding and all the things HR does with less friction. And so I think all of the discussion we've been having for 6 quarters now, Rob, are all symptoms, important ones that need to be dealt with, about how do we get more employee centric. And so I've shared some of this data last time, but I want to share it today as well. I've dropped the word engagement because I think it doesn't mean anything. Are you engaged? Actually, I've been married for 33 years. Thank you. And it's one long survey that is done, and people never hear a response to maybe 6 months later, right before they launch the next survey. And so, so let me share the next page, where it's just some data on another reason why you need to think about your being at risk. This is looking at both office employees and what we call deskless or frontline. So on the left, Nick, in the US, right, it would be the 40% on the left bar and the 60% on the right. Globally, I think it's like 70 to 80% are in the right bar, or frontline workers. We're more service economy. But this is from 2 different pieces of research we've done, some of which you've seen here before on the office piece, but not the deskless piece, which are our word for, frontline workers. Is we said, are you looking for a new job? Actively or passively is the pink. And no, I wouldn't even take a call. Even if someone reached out, I'd say no, thank you, is the gray. And we could say, wow, there are a lot of people at risk. And even though the labor markets have gotten slightly less tight, they're still tighter than they've ever been. And there's still way more jobs than there are people to fill those jobs out there. And this is, so I bashed the term engagement. What I want to replace it with is joy. And I know that sounds really fluffy, but it's tactical, right? Like you could say, hey, Nick, did you enjoy work this week? Or Brian, overall, do you enjoy your job? Or, which parts of your job do you enjoy the most? It is both intuitive, so you can measure it easily, but it's also flexible. Joy for me is different than joy for Brian, different than joy for Rob and Nick. And also joy for me now is different than at 30 years at BCG, or different than it was joy 10 years in with 4 little kids, right? And so it's a flexible term. And if you don't buy that, let me flip to the next page, which is what we call our joy matrix. So we asked, the left is office-based workers, the 40%, the right are deskless frontline workers, and it's global, so it's more 70-30 here. And we ask people a couple questions. One, we say, are you looking for a new job? And so the percentage in the box are the percentage at risk. That's the actively looking or passively looking. Passively is, I'll take a call, right? If you LinkedIn me and you're trying to have a job offer, I'll listen, right? And then we ask people, are you effective at your job? And we define it as efficiency and effectiveness, that vertical axis, right? And we say, like, it's the quantity and quality of work you could do and the time allotted, right? How effective are you at your job? That's the vertical axis. And you could see in both cases, if you go from feeling not effective to effective, it doesn't do much to your attrition risk. And actually, for frontline deskless workers, it actually drives it up a smidgen if you don't enjoy work, which makes total sense. If I don't like my job and I think I'm good at it, I'm more likely to look for a new job. Not surprisingly, when you ask people, do you enjoy your job? Do you enjoy your work? If the answer is yes versus no, you're less likely to look for a job. That's like intuitive. But what I find so striking is the percentage reduction, right? like for office-based workers, you are almost 50% less likely to quit if you enjoy your work. And so if you think about losing your best performers and all the knowledge, which is a reason to think about flexible work that we've been talking about, right? It's an indication, right, of that's something people value. We know they value it from our other research. If they're like, I don't want to give in, well, do you want to cut your attrition in half, right? And for the frontline workers, it's even stronger. If you enjoy your work, you're 60% less likely to quit. And the other sad thing, if you flip to the next page, is we actually did this by having people code their week and how much time they spend in each task on average. We say, look at your last week. And then we say, do you enjoy that task? And are you effective at that task? And if you enjoy it, why? If you don't enjoy it, why not? If you're not effective, why not? And what you see here is the data, and we split it by those not looking on the left and looking for a job or actively or passively on the right, and then office workers on the top and frontline or deskless workers on the bottom. And the thing that jumps out to me is all the white time, all the meh time. Like there's so much opportunity, if you're a glass half full person like me, to make work more enjoyable by filling the meh time with green. Flexibility is certainly a part of it, but there's a lot more. But you're also in risk in filling it with toil. And especially right now where everyone's rolling out Gen AI to Gen AI everything, right? If you roll it out at the green stuff, you're going to make your employees less happy. So it behooves you to understand what creates the lack of joy, or what I call the toil, the red stuff, and what makes that, and point your technologies at taking that away. And the other thing that jumps out as I point to in the middle is just how sensitive people are. Like it just takes a little decrease in joy or a little increase in toil to flip someone from not looking to looking at the bottom. And actually joy is much more powerful in flipping from left to right for frontline workers, because it's sad how much toil they will put up with. Like in frontline worker jobs where you're like in factories or working tough shifts, I think people expect toil to be part of the job. And so anyhow, and then the last slide I'll show, because I know we want to open up to Q&A, is we ask people, well, if you're not enjoying the job overall, not at the task level, but this is overall, what gets in the way? And the green are the emotional attributes, and the gray are the functional attributes. So it's interesting to see, not enjoying the work. So I like that. It has, the joy part in it, don't feel supportive, right? And you could just see some of the reasons, again, from our research about what people are saying. My point is not to say these are the absolute answer, but my point is more to get companies to broaden the aperture, view employees as important to solve for, and get that KPI of employees enjoying work up as high as shareholder value and customer value. And then to do this type of research on your own employees, because you'll come out with different stuff. Trust me, I've done it on populations at BCG. It's fascinating what you learn. And then act on it, because sometimes the flexibility desire is real. And sometimes the flexibility desire is it's just another sign. You don't trust me. You're trying to manage me. I'm just a means of production. All right, I'll stop there, Rob.
Awesome. I love how much ground we're able to cover across like a number of related but pretty different topics. So thank you for all the interesting material. I'm going to start with one of my favorite questions because it's come up, I think, in the past. Matt Boyle asked, and maybe I'll give this to Nick or to Brian to start. The Labor Day return to office event that comes up every year. Is this going to be a watershed moment where companies start to shift back? And Matt's asking because we saw some full-time in office pick up in the largest employers, but maybe Brian or Nick, what are you hearing? You think are we in store for a Labor Day return to office bump or a non-event again this year?
I'm just waiting for Nick to unmute and say flat as a pancake.
I was actually going to use another British analogy.
Oh, good. Bring it on.
Like we've had 4 of them. This will be number 5. It's like, Hull City versus Manchester United. Like, the Labor Day return has been a 0, work from home 4. So looking at is Rob interesting. I was pondering, sharing our data on Sway or the census data or Castle, they all show very similar stuff that you put up earlier, which is work from home figures have been totally flat since the beginning of 2023. The reason the media seems like maybe people are returning to office is there's a huge incentive for journalists to write pieces saying everyone's returning to the office because people furiously click on them and comment and send them around and they get much more press. But in fact, in big data, we don't see it. The other thing we are picking up is there's a clear bump in working from home over the summer. So if we look at days, every summer we've seen a bump. So June, July, August, it picks up. So it's pretty clear there's a lot of companies out there that are relaxing in the summer months. You also see it around Thanksgiving, particularly Christmas. So yes, there's a return to the office in the data in September, but it's really the end of the summer. And September tends to look very similar to May.
Brian, anything you want to add to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a little bit of variation by industry. So there's some stuff that in the latest Flex Index report that Rob shared, and I'll drop a link to my LinkedIn post that has some slides around this stuff. But there are some specific industries where the push is actually greater, right? You're seeing it in financial services more, again, to some degree, especially around people using FINRA, a set of regulations as sort of an excuse for pressing certain groups of people back in. You're also seeing it to some degree in some of the industries where there's been more pressure on talent, period. Like if you look at Rob's data on big firms and that 7% increase, it's really concentrated in professional services, real estate, unsurprisingly, and media and entertainment being the places where you're most likely to see this push happening. Those are also places where they've been shedding talent. So there's a little bit of supposition that some of that may also just be because they're actually looking to shed more talent, which is not exactly, welcome news. There also are industries where they're getting more relaxed and everybody's sort of meeting in the middle. So if you look at some of the industries that were least flexible, restaurants and food service, retail and apparel, they actually got more flexible. So this is just continued movement towards a mean overall. And the last thing I'd say is there's a big difference between, as multiple people have pointed out, between what's the policy and what do human beings actually do at the end of the day. And I don't really know of many firms that are actually hard-nosed, sitting there going, we're going to punish you if you don't come into the office, because they know that bluntly, their most capable, competent people are going to do what they're going to do. And so selective enforcement of policies always ends up screwing up your culture in the first place. Most companies, I think, are actually just sitting there going like, we got better things to do with our time than fight over this particular battle.
There's a question from Don that I'm going to pass to you, Debbie, which is, what are the indicators you're seeing that suggest we're moving toward this more of an employee-centric or employee-oriented model? Do you have anything in particular you can point to or that's kind of driving you in that direction?
Yeah, I don't think we are moving to it. I think we need to move to it. I think there are some companies, and my team at BCG, as part of our Henderson Institute, have done some really nice case studies of, look at a Trader Joe's or a Costco versus a Kroger in terms of being employee centric, and then the revenue per square foot and the revenue per employee, or look at Hubert Jolie's story turning around Best Buy versus turning around, what happened to Circuit City, right? And he took a very employee-centric, one company's still in business, one isn't, right? To turning it around when home electronics went online, right? And so I think there are examples of companies out there that are doing it, but you can look at, you could just look at Glassdoor and see the complaint-a-palooza relative as a symptom. You need to do it. You could look at My Joy data to show, and you could model the impact of cutting attrition by 10%, 20%, 30%, especially a lot of frontline deskless workforce heavy folks. There are examples where they've saved run rate $75, $100 million a year just by cutting attrition and cutting overtime pay. And so there's a financial argument to do it as well. So I don't think our companies are there yet, honestly. And it like you could tell by the way I talk about it, I just want to take them by the shoulders and shake them, not by the neck, because that wouldn't be good, but by the shoulders and shake people to wake up and say, it's such an obvious thing. And the other thing I would say is some companies are getting it, and many of you have probably seen this, they're setting up employee experience centers to focus on employee experiences. but they're doing it all wrong. Like they should actually just take their customer experience centers that have all the tools and the capabilities and just expand their remit to employee experience. And so you're viewing your employee and your customer with the same set of tools and same set of experiences. So long way to go.
I want to go to a question that John asked about flexible work by state, which is something that we've done a fair amount of work on. I think, Nick, you've done some work on too. Asking, is there a direct correlation between length of commute and the rate of flexible work? So we studied this a few months ago and looked pretty in depth about cost of living more broadly, and found that there's a number of relationships between cost of living and what it means to live in a particular metro and the presence of work location flexibility at the firm level, in particular in the United States. And what we found was there are a few things that in particular correlated. One was the higher the cost of living in that particular metro, the more likely the companies were to offer work location flexibility. The second was longer commutes, measured as if you had a higher percentage of employees that were commuting more than 60 minutes on a daily basis, that resulted in a larger percentage of firms offering flexibility. The way to think about that in practice in simple terms is if it costs me more to go into the office, meaning parking, gas, et cetera, paying for lunch, those things drive employees to want to come into the office less often. The second is metros that are expensive tend to have people that live further away from the office because they're looking for cheaper housing relative to where their office may be. So those commutes tend to be longer, which leads to increased demand for work location flexibility. And the third is higher cost metros tend to have more jobs in financial services, technology, professional services, industries that typically have very high rates of work location flexibility given the nature of the work. And so length of commute in some ways is a bit of a proxy for overall cost of living and a number of things that come along with that. Nick, I don't know if there's anything you want to add in that regard, but.
You're totally online. We see that too. The other thing that's really interesting we see is cultural factors. So in the cross-state data, you can look at amount of work from home. You're totally right. It depends on industry and cost of commute and various other things. But we also pick up a blue state effect. So what you see in the US is blue states tend to have higher work from home levels than red states. So if you go to very Trump-leaning parts of the country, work from home significantly lower, even for similar industries, similar education, similar cost of living. You see it more strongly, or similar thing across countries, by the way. So it's one of the reasons when you look in our data, talk to multinationals. Well, sorry, I'm getting spam risk. This is work from home right now. I'm probably trying to be sold some Bitcoin or something. I'm not sure what it's trying to sell me, but you see across countries. So Asia has a dramatically lower work from home level than say North America. And it's very hard to explain it from economic factors. So Rob, you're totally spot on that. The majority is what you go through. We also see some cultural differences.
There's a great question that was that Lauren asked in the chat that I wanted to speak to because I think it's such an interesting one. And effectively asking, is hybrid the end game, or do we think it's a pit stop on the way to other models? I've got a point of view from some of the data that we look at, but Debbie, maybe I'll pass it to you first in terms of what are you thinking is optimal in terms of, I know you've done a lot of work thinking about relative performance at the team and et cetera level.
Yeah, so I think hybrid is the end game because I think the work, the mode needs to match the work. And there is some work that is just frankly better done in person. There are some company-wide human connections that are better done in person. Obviously, you could do a lot. There are people I'm very close with who, Brian, how many times have we been in a room together? Rob once, Nick never, but I feel very close to you guys, right? So, but there is nothing like sitting down and having a meal together, which hopefully we could all do at one point, right? So there are things you need to do in person to be an effective enterprise, at least as far as I could see it. And so I do think the future model will be every manager will have the skills to say, based on the work and based on my team, here are the rhythms and routines we need to work to get the best out of everyone. And that's a muscle that managers don't have. And so when people say, okay, we went to hybrid work, our financial performance is going down, everyone come back because hybrid work isn't working, that's so like wrong, because hybrid work isn't working because you didn't invest in building the muscles to make it work. And that ability to determine the right rhythms and routines, the team level agreements, or as we call them at BCG, team norms, right, is a muscle leaders need. Every manager also needs a muscle to inspire, motivate, connect with, develop, mentor, coach, build community across distributed teams, because you have globally distributed teams and you've had them before COVID. If you want to get the best talent and be in all the markets, right, for large companies. And a third muscle leaders need to make this hybrid, the end game, work, is how to measure based on impact and not input and output, right? And getting that right. And that's an investment organizations need to make to get it all to work. But I think we will get there, because we have to get there, because employees in a radically employee-centric world want us to be there, both because it's the right way, but also because it's sign you trust me and value me, and which you need. But not investing to build the muscles you need to make hybrid work. The analogy I use, and these guys have heard me say it a million times, is it's like saying we're going to go from mainframe to cloud by issuing a memo.
Yeah.
Oh, I issued a memo, didn't spend a dime. I issued a memo, and what? We're not on cloud? Okay. Like, we got to go back to mainframe because cloud's not working. It's the same exact conversation we're having now. I'll leave it there and get off the soapbox.
I'll pick up on one of the things Debbie was saying at the end there, which is this shift to managing people on the basis of outcomes is actually a huge opportunity. And I'm seeing more companies that are realizing they need to make that investment, whether it's objectives and key results or KPIs or whatever methodology they're using. But if you are going to be good at this, you have to get better at how am I going to articulate what are our priorities, what are the outcomes we're trying to drive, how do I ladder that up and down the organization, which isn't just good for hybrid work, it's good for company outcomes, period, and for improving results. So this whole thing turns out to be a real win-win if you do it right. And the other thing that I'm seeing is companies are making modest investments, not huge ones, but modest investments. And what they're doing is they're taking, a little bit of reduction in space, and instead of taking all that to the bottom line, you got to put some of it back into redesigning spaces that are more effective, giving people access to travel funds so you can gather distributed teams and pull them together. And just a small group of people. You can have a group of 3 or 4 people that are central in an organization of tens of thousands that are actually figuring out what are your best practices. How do we help people get continually better, iterate and experiment at being good at distributed work? And it pays off. I've seen this at Allstate. I've seen it at Zillow, which I've linked to something that I wrote on those two earlier, and a bunch of other firms. And the difference here is I was with a C-suite a few months ago, and CEO gets up in front of his 250 leaders and says, I know that about half of you would like me just to stand up here and say that the magic answer is 3, that 3 days a week is our magic answer as an organization. We are a global firm. We have 6 business units. There's no way as CEO that I'm going to have a magic number I'm going to pull out of my hat. Instead, it's actually on all of you to figure out what the right way is for us to do this. And I expect all of you to figure out and work it with your teams to figure out what your own habits and practices are. So that's why I think hybrid, meaning time together as well as time for people to do work where they're most effective, is the right solution. But investing behind it is going to be the key to whether or not people are actually successful, not just in the program, but as a business.
The data in the US supports that as well. I mean, we looked at the percentage of firms that offer remote work, and we've tracked it for 18 months now, and it stayed roughly in the 6% range on an industry adjusted basis the entire time. So we haven't seen any significant movement upward or downward in remote work. And that is significantly disproportionately in smallest firms, right, relative to larger firms. I think the fundamental question for the future, to the point that you both are raising, is at what altitude will flexibility around hybrid work get settled within a company? And that ranges anywhere from the CEO, to your point, Brian, making that decision, to the individual making the choice as to how often they go in, or it could be team, department. That, I think, is probably the least settled piece of this, and where there's the most discussion.
Yeah, and Rob, I don't know if you remember, but we have data on that shows if you're optimizing across tasks for effectiveness and joy, it's the team level. You know, individuals is chaos, and from the top is tyranny. And the team level. So that's why I talk about the muscle. Now, having said that, that's good for intra-team work, but you also need to think from the top, what do we need to maintain a company culture, to think cross-silo, to build the weak ties, and that can come from the top, but it can't be every week. How often do you need to do it? A week a year? A week every 6 months? A week a quarter is like no more than that, certainly.
Rob, can
I
I
want to
ask
go
you-
to a question. Nick, I just want to, just because of the limit on time, I want to go to something else that Isabel had asked and come back to you on it. So Isabel asked a question.
I actually wanted to ask you a question, Rob.
Oh, go for it, please.
I just wanted a data point. It was a fantastic discussion. In the US, do you know what share of managers and professionals are on hybrid?
I think I looked at this recently. I want to say on a firm basis, it was something like just north of 60% of firms were hybrid in some capacity, I believe. And that was across structured hybrid models, meaning kind of like a more set amount of time, and employees' choice models where the company had offices, but employees weren't required to go into them. But the hybrid is significantly disproportionately weighted toward larger firms. And so to your point, if you adjust that to an employee basis, I believe the number was something like 75% of corporate employees are operating in a hybrid type environment in practice. It may even be higher than that. So the average corporate employee is experiencing 2 to 3 days a week in the office across the United States.
Right.
Nick, I want to come back to you because the question that Isabel asked, I thought was an interesting one. She asked, what's the most surprising thing you found this year? I'm struck by the event stats. You know, so many people say they hate workplace events or organized fun. Maybe they don't, or are they being required to do it? Nick, any kind of like thoughts on how people feel about those events and what they like, don't like about that stuff?
I mean, yes, that's a great question. I think there's been a movement. Why I put the slides up, what I thought was interesting is earlier, I'm thinking like 21, 22, I haven't had an idea the event was some big national global thing lasting several days, and you feel like, oh my God, I'm being dragged away from my, I have kids. It's just like painful to be pulled away. And it's, Brian's quote on death by PowerPoint on something else was great. So what I thought was really interesting is it's migrated away from that to something much more palatable, which is half a day with 20 people that you travel for an hour away. And to me that, actually interesting, the economics department in Stanford were organizing something just like that. We polled everyone and they said, look, I would love to hang out with my colleagues. I don't want to have it around PowerPoint, but I want it local and convenient. So events have really taken off, but they're much smaller and local and shorter. And they typically don't involve overnight stay, which is what a lot of people find difficult with, lifestyle. So yes, they're popular, but they've morphed into something that's kind of smaller, more flexible, away from massive 3-day things that are just painful for employees. And it's the 3-day things still happen, by the way, like as a big law firm event. They said they just do it every other year. They say, every other year is about the cadence they're looking at for have some big global thing.
A lot of firms that I've talked with and worked with, especially big tech firms, made the mistake of cutting the travel budget that they promised people back in 2022. So they let people get more distributed and said, well, we're going to give you funds to bring your team together once a quarter. And then come, recession fears, they just whacked the budget entirely. And then they wonder why people don't feel connected to one another. Surprise. So firms that have actually made the investment, I'll use Zillow again as the example because they've actually shared some of the data with me. And they went deeper into what is it that works effectively. And you'll hear lots of classes of thought behind this, but basically a 50-50 blend of the business side of things and social side of things. So finding a way not just to get people together and have a social occasion, but actually to go deeper on what's the work that we're trying to do here, to tie people back to the mission, to the values of their team's specific objectives, and to work on harder stuff together is really valuable. But you got to combine that with like meals together, volunteer activities, other ways in which you get a greater sense of connection and understanding one another as individuals. And last one I'll toss on that, and this comes from Raj Chowdhury, is putting a little intentional design behind that is really important, because what you want is people to commingle who wouldn't normally commingle together. Otherwise, birds of a feather flock together. All the guys stand in one side of the corner and chat with one another. So finding ways to intentionally design these events becomes a pretty big deal, and can actually be really great in terms of driving up both engagement with each other, but also with the work.
It goes back to what I said. If you put the same amount of effort into designing your employee work experience as you put into designing your customer interaction experience, you will create enjoyment or joy.
Brian, I wanted to come back to you on that topic. Brian Berthold asked the question around how are you seeing companies that are doing this well across functions solve this? So you have real estate, HR, IT, other parts of the C-suite. How do you bring data, insight, shared point of view together? And any from the examples you just mentioned or others, companies that are doing this in an effective way?
It's even that first starting point of getting your HR, IT, and workplace team talking to each other and on a shared set of goals is really important. I've seen too many places where either they're bifurcated or you get 2 out of the 3 working together. But those are the 3 sets of capabilities that you need, right? My people team, my place team, and my tech team need to have a set of common direction that they're marching towards. And then you've got to pair that up with your comms organization, right? Because they're the ones that are going to help everybody understand where you're going and what you're doing. But even just that starting point of looking at our own internal data, at our own internal employee engagement surveys, picking out from that, what's one area that's problematic? What's the thing that we are struggling with the most? Let's all work together on that one thing. So Allstate did this. Lauren DeYoung and team have shared some of the information around, like, their big issue wasn't connection with my team, it's connection across teams. So they've ended up with a set of shared goals and metrics across the people team and the workplace team around how do we build connections, to Debbie's point, that cut across different teams in different parts of the organization. They're doing it digitally, they're doing it in person, they're doing it through experimentation. They put together a $10 million fund for people to build connections with one another. And they've got to do it together in order to actually make progress on that one goal. Once you start getting better at that goal, pick out the next one, which, by the way, almost every organization I work with, if you think connection is one problem, try meetings as another place that almost everybody has a set of issues. Like, what hours are we available to one another? But doing it that way and putting consistent effort yields results that you can then build on top of and continue going by having those groups work together in common cause.
I think we're almost at the top of the hour. Oh, go ahead, please, Debbie.
I was going to say my other hope in reinventing work relates to a question Gianni put in the chat that we didn't get to, but Gen AI is forcing everyone to rethink what work is. So as long as we're rethinking what work is, let's put this employee centricity, let's put flexibility into it, right? It's creating an opening because you have to, or you'll be left behind, right? So that gives me hope.
I think we're almost at wrap. So I want to stitch together 2 questions. Maybe we'll do quick rapid fire answers on them. But there's a question from Carl, which was, is there a silver bullet that can help change the minds of leadership that are resistant to implementing flexible working? And then there was another question, which is, are there effective ways to respond to the idea that remote work minimizes productivity? Curious how you've seen those conversations play out, or any thoughts from the group.
Well, I think the silver bullet for executives is to walk in the shoes of your employees day to day who are coming in, like literally just do the old customer ethnography, just follow them around and you will see everything that's broken. Okay, I'm schlepping in over an hour on the subway to sit in a cubicle all day and to do Zoom calls.
Yeah, it's storytelling, right? It's getting them to not just have this conversation up here in the C-suite with one another, or just having it with their board members, which, by the way, is a biased group in the first place. Majority of them are, older, white, and male. It's actually getting them out, listening and hearing it from other employees, and seeing and listening to their own experience. I just dropped an op-ed that I wrote in Charter about this 2 weeks ago into the chat.
I also think a lot of companies are early in their data journey on this topic broadly, and the number of companies that can stitch together amount of time spent in the office relative to performance in any regard is pretty limited at this point. And so one of the things that I think can be very helpful in organizations are starting to see more investment in is how do we integrate more of those data sets so that we actually have some data to bring to that discussion versus qualitative feeling based on personal experience on what leads to higher or lower productivity.
I'll give you one last one that I know Debbie will let go, which is what problem are we trying to solve?
Yeah.
Make sure that you're asking, what outcomes are we missing on, and what problem are we trying to solve here in the first place? Because I'm pretty sure office attendance is not sitting at the root of most issues inside of large organizations these days.
And
the experience of talking to a bunch of execs has been data research. So I'll send around the nature thing. The nature thing for me has been extremely useful because it's a large randomized controlled trial. It's, it's in a journal that all execs know. A lot of execs, certainly CFOs, are very data focused. So yeah, I think talking to individuals has been great. It depends. It depends who you get. You get some people who are very data obsessed and some people that are much more kind of talking to individuals, see it, feel it. But I'm totally aligned that the kind of the optimal combination is both.
And just one last thing on the data. You can model the impact of cutting attrition by 5%, 10%, 20%, 50%. It's not just the cost of recruiting, the productivity impact of that. You take someone who is, 18 months in role versus 6 months in role, you can model it, and that dwarfs the productivity argument.
Well, Debbie, Nick, Brian, as always, tremendously appreciate your time and your insight. I feel like we could go for 3 hours in reality relative to the number of questions, and I apologize for cutting us short on a couple of them. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As a reminder, we'll do a few things. 1, we will share the slides. 2, we will share the recording. 3, I will see if we can share the chat and the Q&A. If your questions didn't get answered, please feel free to send us a note. We will try our best to answer them async. And thank you for spending the time with us.
Thanks for having us. Always fun.